Happy Sunday, everybody. This week, on Tuesday in particular, is Constitution Day. And perhaps because I am the resident political person in my ward, I was asked to give a talk in church today on the topic of the Constitution. So today's musing is a little bit of an expanded version, since I don't have quite the time limitations that I do for my talk, about our constitutional conundrums and condemnations. I think giving a talk like this, or being assigned to give a talk like this, the idea is, let's talk about how the Constitution is divinely inspired and how, God has given us this Constitution and all is well in Constitution land. But as you'll see throughout this musing, I chose for my talk to take a little bit of a different take on the issue. To start, I want to share a quote from Ezra Taft Benson, 1966. This was a speech at the Assembly Hall at Temple Square, and perhaps this portion of the quote will be familiar to you. It's how he opened his address. He said, "I'm not here to tickle your ears, to entertain you. I will talk to you frankly and honestly. The message I bring is not a happy one, but it is the truth, and time is always on the side of truth. As the German philosopher Goethe said, truth must be repeated again and again because error is constantly being preached round about. I realize," Benson continues, "that the bearer of bad news is always unpopular. As a people, we love sweetness and light, especially sweetness." So I share that remark at the outset because as I think about our relation to the Constitution and how we as a church people, as Mormons, have kind of taken up that charge that I'll get into with some of the scriptures, I'm reminded not only of that quote from President Benson, which will color my entire musing about this whole concept that let's speak truthfully and plainly rather than sweetness and light and tickling one another's ears, but I'm also reminded of what God has said on several occasions. He said it to Isaiah in chapter 29. He said it to the Pharisees, Matthew chapter 15, and in Joseph Smith, recorded in Joseph Smith's history in the first vision. Here's the version from Matthew chapter 15. It says, Jesus said, "This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." So this is an observation that Jesus has made at least in three separate occasions, likely more that I just didn't think of, and others that perhaps have not been captured in Scripture that we have. This concept that it's very easy to draw near to God and to claim things with our mouth, with our words. It's quite different to have our heart tied to God, yearning for, being a disciple of Christ. Words are easier than actions. It's comparatively easy, for example, I think, to live a superficial gospel, to follow simple checklists, to stick with the sweetness and light that President Benson mentioned. I also believe it was easy for the Pharisees to live with their insanely long checklists of compliance because they had very clear guidelines that required superficial compliance that they could kind of systematize, automate, habituate themselves to. So I think even though we look at that as like, oh my gosh, this cumbersome set of rules, I think they had kind of designed for themselves this gospel, this corrupted gospel that was predictable. It was comfortable. It was something that they had systematized and that they could kind of judge themselves with a score of, how compliant and religious they were based on those behaviors. So why I think that is because living that way, the sweetness and the light and the checklists and all the things is superficial. It doesn't require the tough, soul-wrenching work that we see throughout the scriptures. I think of, Alma the Younger in Alma 36. He says, "I was tormented with the pains of hell. Yea, I saw that I had rebelled against my God, and that I had not kept his holy commandments. So great had been my iniquities, that the very thought of coming to the presence of God did rack my soul with inexpressible horror." There's also, for example, Enos. "My soul hungered, and I kneeled down before my Maker, and I cried unto him in mighty prayer and supplication for mine own soul. All the day long did I cry unto him. Yea, and when the night came, I did still raise my voice high that it reached the heavens." King Lamoni, after Ammon converted him, It says he fell unto the earth as if he were dead. Nephi, the son of Helaman, praying. People are walking by saying, what's going on that this guy is crying out? Saul and his conversion to become Paul, Job, King David, Peter after denying Christ. So many examples of having to do the tough, deep work to root out of ourselves this kind of Babylonian, Caesarean, corrupt, the distractions, the loyalties, the idolatry, the sin. The natural man, I think, wants us to be content with believing ourselves to be righteous, despite, as Neil Maxwell said, having a summer cottage in Babylon, right? The natural man wants us to, like the Pharisees and others, it's like, oh, here, you've constructed this little, religious set of observances and you're doing great, so pat yourself on the back and keep going. Or, the natural man wants us to think that our eye is, in fact, single to God's glory while we embrace all kinds of idolatry around us. Or, for today's topic, perhaps the natural man wants us to think that we're, champions of the Constitution, supporters of the Constitution, friends of the Constitution, when we actually aren't. So the question is, do we as a people draw near to the Constitution with our mouth, honoring it with our lips, but our heart is far from it? Or them, the principles. Do we draw near to the principles of the Constitution with our mouth, but our heart is far from those principles? So a couple scriptures to kind of frame things, both in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 98 to start. And that law of the land, which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, which is the constitutional law of the land. Another one in section 101, according to the laws and constitution of the people, which I have suffered to be established, and should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles. And for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men, whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. Okay, that last part, saying that that these wise men have been raised up by God for the very purpose of establishing the constitution of the land. That's where a lot of times I think we settle and we fixate, and to whatever amount of attention that we do give to constitutional things, we think about history. And yes, sure, the founding fathers were raised up for the purpose as explained in that verse, and that's great. Learning about what they did is important, but it's woefully inadequate. Years ago, when we started working on our American History Tuttle Twins books, we did a lot of research into the conventional, like the textbooks, social studies textbooks that are used in most schools. And these books are chock full of superficial stuff. This person on this date did this, they traveled from here to here, they wrote this letter, this committee met, they wore this color uniform, they traveled, blah, 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 right? All the superficial stuff. But the principles were absent, the values, the ideas, the philosophy, the meaty debates, the substance. It was all superficiality instead of substance. And so I came away from that thinking, as I did when I was a kid in school, why should I care about what happened 250 years ago? Why learn this stuff? What's the point? Right? Like, who cares that, they used muskets and they ate hardtack and cannonballs weighed this much and this committee met on this date and, wrote this document. These textbooks don't relate the issues of the past to our day. The whole point of history, from my perspective, is to help inform and guide our actions today. Those who don't learn from the mistakes of the past are condemned to repeat them. Right? The whole point is to build, to grow upon what came before, and to navigate our lives today using the lessons of the past. So sure, back to our verse, yes, the founding fathers were raised up for this purpose. They played their role 250 years ago, right? But the point is, let's learn from them and apply things today. So it's not this question of let's fixate on what their role was and what they did, although that's important, but it's really important in order to help inform what we should do. So the question is, now that we know what the founding fathers' role was, they were raised up for this purpose, great. What's your role? What's our role? That, to me, is far more interesting and important than continuing to read about and think about and talk about what the founding fathers' role were. As important as that was, it's irrelevant if we are not learning from and implementing those ideas today. I think of the Pharisees that are obsessed with, proving their lineage and talking about Moses and Abraham and other patriarchs, always focused on the actions of those patriarchs rather than their own. And I think this is among other reasons why Jesus called them hypocrites and whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. That's in Matthew 23. And a little bit later in the chapter, he says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets." Right? Building the tombs of the prophets, thinking of the past, garnering their sepulchres, being kind of obsessed with this past stuff. Or in Matthew 15, then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, "Why do thy disciples transgress the traditions of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread." But he answered and said unto them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition?" So they had elevated their tradition, their past, the Moses and the Abraham, and what Moses taught us, and all these little interpretations of what Moses said, and getting distracted by the past and fixated on the past rather than focusing on us and not being whited sepulchres, having, internal integrity, spiritual integrity, in implementing in our lives today the substance, the values, the ideas, the teachings, the philosophies. So I think we do have a role. The Founding Fathers had a role. We have a role. Well, what is that role? 3 months into the constitutional, or 3 months of having the Constitutional Convention, these guys were hammering out the details and compromise and so forth. Well, Washington was seated on a chair presiding over the convention, and there was on the back of the chair at the top, it was this wooden chair, there was this carved half sun at the top. So at the close of the convention, Benjamin Franklin stands up and he says, "I have often in the course of our convention and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to the issue of creating the Constitution, I've looked at this half sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." He's basically saying what we've done here at this Constitutional Convention has positioned America for greatness. The sun is rising on this grand experiment of liberty. So, he's outside, Franklin, he's sitting on a bench. A woman approaches him from Philadelphia and says to Franklin, and this is a very well-known quote, she says, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin replied, "A republic if you can keep it." So that, to me, is our role. Can we keep the Constitution? This is our work, to put in the effort to support its core principles. And it's not because, the document is this great thing and it's important and strong, but that we are strong when embodying its principles. It's more about us and not this document. In fact, the document itself is not strong. James Madison, who's widely regarded as the father of the Constitution, except that he wasn't. Most of his plan was rejected. He predicted the new government would fail within a few years. He refused credit when people would say that he wrote the Constitution, and yet, history being what it is, he's revered as the father of the Constitution. But in the Federalist Papers, he wrote the following: "Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. The legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex." So the key line here is that Madison himself refers to the Constitution as a parchment barrier against the encroaching spirit of power, that the intent was to preserve the more feeble against the more powerful, to protect rights, to separate powers and to keep things in check, right? But that ultimately the document, the very Constitution that God, raised these founders to establish, he's calling it a parchment barrier. He wrote also to Thomas Jefferson, Madison did. This is October 1788. He said, "Experience proves the inefficacy of a Bill of Rights on those occasions when its control is most needed. Repeated violations of these parchment barriers have been committed by overbearing majorities in every state. In Virginia, I have seen the Bill of Rights violated in every instance where it had been opposed to a popular current. Notwithstanding the explicit provision contained in that instrument for the rights of conscience, it is well known that a religious establishment would have taken place in that state if the legislative majority had found, as they expected, a majority of the people in favor of the measure. And I'm persuaded that if a majority of the people were now of one sect, the measure would still take place, and on narrower ground than when it was proposed, notwithstanding the additional obstacle which the law has since created. Wherever the real power in a government lies, there is the danger of oppression. In our governments, the real power lies in the majority of the community, and the invasion of private rights is chiefly to be apprehended not from acts of government contrary to the sense of its constituents, but from acts in which the government is the mere instrument of the major number of the constituents." This whole concept from, I didn't have it documented, so I'm going to go off the top of my head, but when, Mosiah changes to the rule of the judges, and he says it's not common that the, will of the people, the majority of the people favor that which is wrong, therefore select from among you judges, right? And so here Madison is saying none of this constitutional stuff works if the majority wants something, that encroaching spirit of power that he wrote about in Federalist Papers, because if the majority wants something, then this parchment barrier is not going to stand in their way. So again, to the question of our responsibility, a republic, if you can keep it, what is our role? Well, I think we are the true barrier. We the people, right? Not a parchment barrier, not the Constitution. And to that end, there are so many quotes from these very founding fathers raised up for this purpose, who themselves attest that the whole constitutional experiment, such as it is, will only work provided that people have integrity, morality, religion, that they are self-limiting in their actions. John Adams, perhaps with the most famous quote, said that we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. George Washington, he said that of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Washington, on another occasion, said that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Again and again, these guys are talking about how important personal responsibility and accountability and integrity and morality is in order for this grand experiment to work, for a parchment barrier to be able to withstand any encroaching spirit of power. Thomas Jefferson said, "No government can continue good but under the people's control, and their minds are to be informed by education what is right and wrong, to be encouraged in virtuous habits and deterred from vice." James Madison, "To suppose any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without virtue in the people is a chimerical idea." Patrick Henry, "A vitiated state of morals, a corrupted public conscience is incompatible with freedom." And finally, Samuel Adams, who said, "Neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt." Because, again, it's not about the words on the paper. It's not about this parchment barrier and the specific semantic, debate of little words here and what this word says. Like, that's ultimately not what matters. It's the principles that that document aims to establish and protect. And if we are not a principled people acting with virtue and integrity and respecting people's rights, then what good can words on paper do. So what are these principles? What are the principles that we're supposed to cherish and support? Well, I left out a couple verses in Doctrine and Covenants 101, so let's go back there and read with the middle verses intact. According to the laws and constitution of the people, which I've suffered to be established, and should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles, that every man may act in doctrine and principle pertaining to futurity, according to the moral agency which I have given him, that every man may be accountable for his own sins at the day of judgment. Therefore, it is not right that any man should be in bondage one to another. And for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. So, question for you and for me. Do we know what these just and holy principles are? Right? I've suffered the constitution to be established. It should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh according to just and holy principles. What are those just and holy principles? If I asked you to create a list of 5 to 10 such principles, could you do it? What would you include? And can we defend principles if we don't truly understand them? Can we hold those accountable who violate them if we don't understand what these principles are and can't recognize when they're being violated? I think of Doctrine and Covenants section 38. You hear of wars in far countries, and you say that there will soon be great wars in far countries, but ye know not the hearts of men in your own land. If we can't identify when these people in our country, in our communities, are violating their oaths of office, violating the principles of these documents, then what good is it to be distracted by wars in faraway lands and all these things if we can't see the corruption in our own backyard? And if the Constitution should be maintained for our rights, do we know what those are? And can we resist those who try to undermine them? So when in section 101 it says that the Constitution should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh, I think that's talking about us. That's our responsibility. A republic, if you can keep it, how do we keep it? We should maintain these principles. Well, what are the principles? I think one easy way to answer that question is the preamble to the Constitution itself. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Let's unpack that a little bit, because I think that holds a nice little framework for what some, not all perhaps, what some of these just and holy principles are that this parchment barrier was intended to secure and protect. So we the people. Well, Joseph Smith, when he ran for president, he put together an essay called Views of the Powers and the Policy of the Government. And this was kind of a tract, a brochure used to explain his platform, his positions on various political things. And in that document, written 1844, February, this is just a few months before he was assassinated and murdered, it said in that document, "In the United States, the people are the government, and their united voice is the only sovereign that should rule, the only power that should be obeyed. The aspirations and expectations of a virtuous people," there's that virtue again, "environed with so wise, so liberal, so deep, so broad, and so high a charter of equal rights as appears in said Constitution, ought to be treated by those to whom the administration of the laws is entrusted with as much sanctity as the prayers of the saints are treated in heaven." So the beneficiaries of these principles, the Constitution, is all people, not the elites, not the mercantilists, not the Hamiltonians, not the central bankers, right? This is to protect all flesh, the rights of all flesh, all of God's children. So we, the people, in a very kind of broad sense, the purpose is to, as Section 101 said, no one should be in bondage to one another. It's for the rights and protection of all flesh. Okay, next in the preamble, in order to form a more perfect union. Well, in George Washington's farewell address, he warned of the baneful effects of the spirit of partisanship. He said, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. So Joseph, for his part, he was praiseworthy of politicians who could lay aside what he called party strife, and like brothers, citizens, and friends mingle together with courtesy, respect, and friendship. He was very much wanting to find people who could unify to form a more perfect union. And in his candidacy for presidency, he was seeking after that unity. He said, "Unity is power. And when I reflect on the importance of it to the stability of all governments, I am astounded at the silly moves of persons and parties to foment discord in order to ride into power on the current of popular excitement. Democracy, Whiggery, and cliquery will attract their elements and foment divisions among the people, to accomplish fancied schemes and accumulate power, while poverty, driven to despair like hunger, forcing its way through a wall, will break through the statutes of men to save life and mend the breach in prison glooms. We've had Democratic presidents, Whig presidents, and pseudo-Democratic Whig president, and now it's time to have a president of the United States." So unity is very important for him. In fact, littered throughout the Doctrine and Covenants, you find all kinds of references to unity. D&C 38, "I say unto you, be one, and if you're not one, you're not mine." Or section 42, "that my covenant people may be gathered in one day, in that day when I shall come to my temple." Section 45, "With one heart and with one mind gather up your riches, that you may purchase an inheritance, which shall hereafter be appointed unto you." Or here's from the Times and Seasons in 1842. "The cause of God is one common cause, in which the saints are alike all interested. We are all members of the one common body, and all partake of the same Spirit, and are baptized into one baptism, and possess alike the same glorious hope. The advancement of the cause of God and the building up of Zion is as much one man's business as another's. The only difference is that one is called to fulfill one duty, and another's duty. But if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. And if one member is honored, all the rest rejoice with it. And the eye cannot say to the ear, I have no need of thee, nor the head to the foot. Party feelings, separate interests, exclusive designs should be lost sight of in the one common cause in the interest of the whole." So obviously we can look around us today at the kind of socio-political environment in which we live, and it is the polar opposite of what we read here about this aspirational unity, this just and holy principle. Next one, establish justice. This issue in particular was on Joseph's mind after being repeatedly arrested and incarcerated. D&C 123 in particular is all about documenting the abuse of the saints by their enemies, with the point of exacting justice by seeking a redress of their grievances. Here's verse 6. "That we may not only publish to all the world, but present them to the heads of government in all their dark and hellish hue, as the last effort which is enjoined on us by our Heavenly Father, before we can fully and completely claim that promise which shall call him forth from his hiding place, and also that the whole nation may be left without excuse before he can send forth the power of his mighty arm." When he was commenting on his run for President of the United States, Joseph said, "As the world have used the power of government to oppress and persecute us, it is right for us to use it for the protection of our rights." So very interested in using government to exact justice, both on their enemies, but then use it to promote justice for others and themselves to protect their rights. Obviously, Joseph and the early saints had good reason to be very concerned about justice and focusing on that as a principle because they were experiencing such substantial injustice. Next principle, ensure domestic tranquility. Joseph was especially focused on this. Here's this quote. He says, "Although the Constitution provides that men shall enjoy religious freedom, yet it does not provide the manner by which that freedom can be preserved, nor for the punishment of government officers who refuse to protect the people in their religious rights, or punish those mobs, states, or communities who interfere with the rights of the people on account of their religion. Its sentiments are good," the Constitution he's saying, "but it provides no means of enforcing them." So domestic tranquility, again, like justice, they were experiencing a lot of lack of tranquility. And Joseph in particular is saying there has to be accountability. If we really want domestic tranquility, we need to hold people accountable. And in section 134, keep in mind this is not a revelation. Oliver Cowdery submitted it to a general assembly of the church in which Joseph Smith was absent. I think he was in Canada. Nevertheless, he came back and kind of gave his thumbs up, but it's not a revelation. It's just a statement of principles, their political positions. In verse 8, it says that for the public peace and tranquility, all men should step forward and use their ability in bringing offenders against good laws to punishment. So this idea that if we want to have tranquility, there has to be accountability to bring offenders to justice. Otherwise, we can't preserve the public peace if these corrupt people are getting away with it, if the system is rewarding and even incentivizing malfeasance and abuse. Next principle, to provide for the common defense. This is both an individual and a collective principle. So for individual defense, the very day that Joseph was murdered, just hours before, he writes a letter to his wife Emma, his only wife. And so this is June 27th. And he says in that letter, there is one principle which is eternal. It is the duty of all men to protect their lives and the lives of the household whenever necessity requires, and no power has the right to forbid it. This is just hours before he then actually attempted to defend himself, including with a firearm, to preserve his own life, this idea of individual defense. He also said on another occasion, peace, be still, bury the hatchet and the sword. The sound of war is dreadful in my ear. But any man who will not fight for his wife and children is a coward and a bastard. Back to section 134, again, just a statement of political views by the early saints. But in verse 11, they argued, we believe that all men are justified in defending themselves, their friends, and property, and the government from the unlawful assaults and encroachments of all persons in times of exigency where immediate appeal cannot be made to the laws and relief afforded. So Joseph believed the law should protect and defend the saints and all citizens from wrongs and abuses that were inflicted upon them, and felt quite strongly that the government had failed to defend the saints in Ohio and in Missouri. So providing for defense, ensuring the domestic tranquility, ensuring justice, these are all, of course, quite interrelated, as is the next one, to promote the general welfare. And in a letter from Liberty Jail, this is 5 years prior, 1839, Joseph wrote that this principle of liberty guarantees to all parties, sects, and denominations and classes of religion equal, coherent, and indefeasible rights. They are things that pertain to this life, therefore all are alike interested. Hence we say that the Constitution of the United States is like a great tree, under whose branches men from every clime can be shielded from the burning rays of the sun. 2 years later, as mayor in Nauvoo, Joseph sponsored an ordinance on religious liberty in Nauvoo, which provided that all religious sects and denominations whatever shall have free toleration and equal privileges in this city. 2 years after that, July 1843, Joseph writes in his journal, if we would secure and cultivate the love of others, we must love others, even our enemies, as well as friends. Why is this babbler gains so many followers and retains them? Because I possess the principle of love. All I can offer the world is a good heart and a good hand. Mormons can testify whether I'm willing to lay down my life for a Mormon. If it has been demonstrated that I have been willing to die for a Mormon, I am bold to declare before heaven that I am just as ready to die for a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or any other denomination. It is a love of liberty which inspires my soul. Civic and religious liberty were diffused into my soul by my grandfathers while they dandled me on their knees. And finally, the January following, 1844, Joseph wrote, I would strive to administer the government according to the Constitution and the laws of the Union, and that as they make no distinction between citizens of different religious creeds, I should make none. Back to this concept, promoting the general welfare, not having these exclusionary things where the elite or the rich or the politically connected or the, these corporations that lobby or whatever, where there's disparate treatment, disparate outcomes, as we see all over the criminal justice system, where, someone can get, like Ross Ulbricht, like a double life sentence for starting a website, where other people are murdering and raping and doing all these horrible things and getting 8 years and then letting go after 3 years on parole. So totally disparate systems. And then, of course, in the Book of Mormon, we read about that the secret combinations govern themselves with the laws of wickedness, specifically to exempt themselves from the laws that are being used for everybody else, and they help one another get away with all their nefarious deeds. Final principle in the preamble of the Constitution, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So back to section 123, this is the Liberty Jail letter. Joseph talked about seeking redress and securing justice to hold evil people accountable. And it was very focused on, as the preamble says, securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Section 123 is talking about futurity, the rising generation, blessings to our posterity. So let's read a few verses. And also, it is an imperative duty that we owe to all the rising generation and to all the pure in heart. These things should be then attended to with great earnestness. Let no man count them as small things, for There is much which lieth in futurity pertaining to the saints, which depends upon these things. So this future outlook on trying to construct a legal system and ensure domestic tranquility and justice and general welfare, and not just for us ourselves now, but for our posterity, for people in the future, right? To have a long-term view, to have a long time preference where we're not just focused on and fixated on what's in front of us and the cares of our life, but we're thinking long-term. Okay, and then as we think about these principles, right? A republic, if you can keep it, that these principles should be maintained, the Constitution should be maintained, that we have a responsibility to do something here. I want to offer the theory that voting is inadequate. Merely casting a vote is not enough to defend, to support these principles. When was the last time you read the Constitution? Or that you read it with your kids, or, that we studied its principles by reading history or political philosophy. The scriptures, in particular the Book of Mormon, talk about acting rather than being acted upon. 2 Nephi 2, for example, it says that man was created to act for themselves and not be acted upon. So there's this concept of action and reaction. You're acting or you're being acted upon. And voting is reactive. It's passive. It's reactive. It's a reactionary thing. Other people have chosen to run for office. Campaigns have been set up. Signs have been plastered everywhere. They have their statements and their campaign platforms and so forth. And you are reacting to these external circumstances by voting. As passive. You are being acted upon by waiting until the very last minute. It's like when I'm up at the legislature and we're working on stuff. People show up at, committee, or they go to watch the floor vote for all the Senate or whatever, and they think that's where the decisions are being made. That's where they're voting. Well, they've already made up their minds. There's this whole long process where people, lobbyists, constituents, others are interacting with these lawmakers and engaging them in discussion and trying to persuade them to their view. And that's where the real work is done. That's where, if you want to be effective, you have to do far before the vote, to the point where you already know the way everyone's going to vote because you've talked to them and you've done the work. Similarly, voting for the average citizen is extremely reactive, and it's waiting until the very last minute when the real decisions and outcomes and influences and factors have all been previous to that, where you could have had real influence. But, you wait until, not you, viewer, I'm sure you're exempt from this, but people in general just wait to vote and think that they're doing their civic duty and so forth. But by then, there's hardly anything to do. I think of section 58 in the Doctrine and Covenants. It says, "Verily I say, men should be anxiously engaged in a good cause, and do many things of their own free will, and bring to pass much righteousness." We are supposed to act rather than being acted upon. If it's voting, sure, fine, vote, but you're being acted upon at that point. Better to act, better to be anxiously engaged in good causes, better to find ways to promote the general welfare and ensure domestic tranquility and justice and so forth on a daily basis, on a regular basis. Support an organization, right? Go to an online debate, start a book club, start a YouTube channel talking about, these ideas. Hold a cottage meeting in your home for the mayor or your, state representative. There's so many ways to start to radiate these principles, to defend them. Write an op-ed for the paper calling out the district attorney when he, lets off this criminal easy but slam through the book against this other one and having disparate outcomes or whatever, right? But engage, be anxiously engaged in a good cause. That, I think, is how we play our part. We don't content ourselves with voting and being grateful for the Founding Fathers 250 years ago and yay, support the Constitution, right? All is not well in Zion. All is not well in America or other countries whose constitutions have been modeled after our own. We are supposed to be active. The scriptures that we read earlier talked about befriending the Constitution. I think that implies an active role. When you befriend someone, you are actively inviting them to your home, inviting them out to lunch, complimenting them, asking them questions about themselves. That is to befriend, right? It's not this passive oh, yeah, sure, we're friends. I haven't talked to them in 10 years. Last night was my 25th high school reunion, 25th anniversary high school reunion. I didn't go. I've never gone to any of them. But it's like those people aren't my friends, right? Because there hasn't been this ongoing engagement. So to me, it's kind of worthless to be like, hey, let's go party and see one another after 25 years. Similarly, I think it's worthless to, oh, it's Constitution Day. Yay, we support the Constitution, even though all we do is vote. We're being acted upon. We're not acting, right? To act, as it says in the scriptures that we read, to act in doctrine and principle pertaining to futurity. We're supposed to act, not react, not be acted upon. We're not supposed to be passive. We're supposed to be active. We're supposed to be anxiously engaged. And so a republic, if you can keep it, means that if we are not actively engaged, if we're just passively reacting to others, then the people who are acting are doing so against our own interests, and we're just asleep at the wheel. And we lose the republic, and these principles get violated, and we're disobeying and disregarding the commandments to actively engage in this process. So this is truth. It is not popular. It is not sweetness and light. It is not pleasant to hear that we have more work to do and there's more that we should be doing, right? We'd rather just think like, we're doing great. Just keep on doing what you're doing, right? But as we think about Constitution Day, such as it is, and we think that we're a good Constitution-supporting people, I want to challenge that assumption for myself, for you, for people in my ward, and have us consider whether we are drawing near to the Constitution sporadically and infrequently with our lips, whereas our heart is far from its principles, and we're not actively engaged, anxiously engaged in defending them. So perhaps an opportunity for reflection for all of us about what does it mean for us to not just learn history from 250 years ago, but how can I learn from those ideas and help defend them today? How can I be the barrier to the encroaching spirit of power rather than relying on a parchment barrier that has long since been torn up? What is your role? Not what is the founding fathers' role and they were raised up for this purpose. What were you raised up for? What is our role? What's our responsibility? That to me is a far more pressing and interesting and important question for us to consider. So hopefully that was enjoyable. It was about 3 times as long as my talk, so they got a very condensed version, as you might imagine. We'll leave it there, and I'll see you next Sunday. In the meantime, happy Constitution Day.